Good morning. Good morning, AP family. As I mentioned, just want to again welcome everyone to today. What an honor it is to be with you this morning. Again, my name is Aaron Hinojosa. I'm the executive director for the Student Center for Reconciliation and Diversity. I want to welcome you on behalf of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, Dr. Keith Hall, who is with us today, as well as Dr. Richard Martinez, who is the Executive Director for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusive Excellence. I believe Everett Brooks is with us as well, who's the Executive Director of our Office of Military and Veterans Services. So I want to thank all of the leadership as well as faculty and staff that are joining us today. I wanted to take this time to just briefly pray for us, and then we will get started. So if we could, however you center yourself in prayer, please take a moment for that and let us pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for today, Lord, for another day of life, Lord, for this opportunity that we have to be together. Lord, I'm thankful for those that are on the call, for those that will listen to this later, for the communities that they represent, for the land that they occupy. Lord, I'm thankful for those that are doing work that is reconciling, that is equitable, that is bringing justice to the kingdom. Lord, thank you for Nicole Johnny. Lord, thank you for who she is, Lord. Thank you for her leadership, for her perspective, for her narrative that she will share with us today. In your name, we pray. Amen. Well, again, good morning. I want to introduce to you, we have the privilege, not only for an alum of Azusa Pacific, but for a leader in the Navajo Nation, a leader in this country. And I just want to take the time to introduce to you Nicole Johnny. Nicole Johnny is a member of the Navajo Nation, currently works for REDW. It's a business valuations, serves on 3 boards. 2 of them are nonprofit, one of them which is a $60 million tribal business. She's a graduate of Pepperdine University with an MBA in finance, her undergraduate degree in finance and economics from Azusa Pacific University. She's also a Mel Scholar, which is I'm proud of as well, because that is part of our office, a multi-ethnic leader office. Nicole grew up in the Navajo Nation in Crystal, New Mexico, is bilingual, speaking both Navajo and English. So I'm going to stop there and bring on Nicole Johnny. Good morning, Nicole.
Yeah, it's Bene. Good morning. That's how you say good morning in Navajo. Thank you again for letting me have some of your time this morning. I appreciate this space and the opportunity to kind of share a little bit of, my perspective as Navajo. And as we always begin, in my culture as an introduction of who we are. So, Nana Yat Ea Bene, Shik Edo Shidina, Sheya, Nicole Johnny Nishia, Kia Ani Nishlando, Tsna Jene Bashishin, Trabahe Dashiche, Adon Nasha Shidina Dashanella, Akut Ego the Ne Asana Nishlando, Twons Ele de Nasha, Kareya, Bede Dasanil Esharande, Otto, it's good morning. For those of you who might have not heard Navajo being spoken, that is the way I introduce myself to you in the Navajo language. And to kind of run down a little bit of what I said hello, good morning. My name is Nicole Johnny, and in Navajo culture and society, we are a matrilineal society, and we have our clans. And my clans are, I'm born to the Towering House clan. I'm born for the Blackstreak Wood people. My maternal grandfathers are the Water Edge clan, and my paternal grandfather is the Tewa Bear people clan. I come from Crystal, New Mexico, And but I currently live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. However, today I am coming from you from Denahpequeya, 1 mile away from the capital of the Navajo Nation in Selahodzanade, which is Window Rock, Arizona. So Nanayat, good morning, hello. I think as an Indigenous person, well, first of all, I was sharing with Aaron and others that, this week is kind of the beginning and the week-long celebration that we have of Indigenous peoples, week of our Heritage Month, because it is also November. So it is Native American or Indigenous Heritage Month. And today, November 15th, is what we call Rock Your Mocks. Mocks, short for moccasins, because tribes all over the United States and Canada, and even Mexico and South America, we all have our traditional footwear. And so these are the moccasins I was wearing today in celebration. These are our low top Navajo style moccasins as well. I was wearing them earlier, but I thought I would, take them off to show them you guys today. So, we always like to participate in, the week-long events that we have of, really celebrating who we are as Indigenous people. I think it's definitely important. And as you might be aware, there's a lot of conversation now of, land acknowledgements, and I would say that you guys there on campus, you guys are on Tongva land, and that is definitely, I think important to know, because as you are in higher education and relearning, a lot of things that you might not have had the chance to learn is, one of them is, Indigenous people. And I've always stressed this so many times, is that Indigenous people, we are not this historical contextual people, we are here, we are thriving, and we exist today in this modern realm. We might not always be wearing our traditional clothing that, makes it so stark of who we are as people. I come to you today, I have blonde highlights, but, traditionally our hair is dark, but it's, challenging that conception of, what traditionally we are to who we are today, and that we look different, that we're not all the same, that we're not just this one tribe. It's not the case. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes in North America and are in the United States, and so that's not even including Canada and Mexico and all of North America, of all the Indigenous people who's occupied this land, and how we're still here today. And I think even in California, I think there's around 100 to 110 federally recognized tribes in California. I don't know if you guys know that, but I think that's some good knowledge to start off well. And I think, it's important to know that, because when you see the land and the resources that had built, United States to what it is today, a lot of it has, come down to land and to, the westward expansion, and to wanting to really believe, what is American. I think, I don't even remember what song it is, but when you talk about America being from sea to shining sea, it has this sense of like conquering, the sense of this belongs to Americans, but at the time, Americans did not include people of color necessarily. Rather, I think that, having that in such American patriotism is very, in a way, uncomfortable, because it erases, my people, it erases, a whole bunch of Indigenous people of where we've, existed here, as time immemorial. We've always, laid claims to our land here, and to, and now we see, water. We lay claims to our water, to our land, to who we are, because in who we are as Indigenous people, it's like we are the caretakers of the land around us. In Navajo, we call earth, the ground that we walk on, Shema Nahasan, and Shema in Navajo is mom. is mother. And so when you say Shamatna Hassan, you're saying Mother Earth. You literally are calling her mother. You're calling her mom. And that's the ground that we walk on. That's who we are. And, and having that ingrained in such, a young age of knowing like that's the earth, that's our mom. We take care of her. She takes care of us. And in return, it's this balance that we are supposed to have, with nature and with nature around us. And I think it really comes back to, going back to understanding that, as Indigenous people, we really do understand what it is to take care of the land around us, because maybe not only in Navajo language, but other tribal languages as well, there's the connection to the earth that we have. And in Navajo, we just so happen to call her Mother Earth, quite literally.
Wow, that's so great. What a and you and I have talked multiple times over the years, and I think I'm always amazed at the ability to make the conversation so present, as you mentioned, right? This is even how we came to this discussion, was the idea of the present and the future of Indigenous people, so that not only is it awareness, but it's understanding that there are still things that need to happen and do, and how people that do not identify as Indigenous or Native American, how they can be a part of supporting and helping and being allies in that work. And so with that, what are some of the current day events and important policies and things that are going on within, maybe just not just within the Navajo Nation, but in Indigenous people in general, that we should be aware of, and how we should approach them? What should we learn?
Right. And I think that's always like a good question to ask, because, there are a lot of issues, at play, whether it's federal, state, or even, regional or local. I think a lot of it impacts and having to understand and taking a step further, like, what does it mean to impact other communities, and in particular, Indigenous communities. One of the largest, movements that we've seen is, the MMIW, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, because as we had all seen what happened with, Miss Gabby Petito, of the crazy search that had been put out forward to find her and to figure out what happened. Whereas, with, women of color, particular Indigenous women, a lot of, women go missing, and there's not the resources that we see, put forward in the same effort to recover, our relatives out there. And I think there's been some good movement in bringing this and highlighting and amplifying the voices behind it, because, it is important. It is, I could tell you stats upon stats upon stats of it, but really the crux of it is that this is part of the systems of inequality and injustices towards people of color, and in particular towards Indigenous people, because Indigenous people, why it's so important to remember us as currently existing, is that a lot of our history is either completely just left out when you're looking at American history. We get little blurbs here and there, but history is always told, from the power that is in play at the time. So you're not going to hear a lot of, the Indigenous narratives or the Indigenous voices of what had actually occurred at that time. And I think that plays into, the current systems that we see now. A lot of Indigenous contemporary people will say that colonialism is still happening now. And and why it's important is that the colonialism that is happening now has implemented systems that have created such vast inequalities in a lot of areas of life for, Indigenous people. The fact that there are reservations, in play. Like, I grew up on the reservation. I grew up on the Navajo Nation. The fact that, like, at a certain point in time, Indigenous people were not allowed to leave reservations. Like, there were guards, there were, people at the at the entries, at the borders of, of land, of where you couldn't leave unless you had permission, or you couldn't leave unless you had XYZ, and like at that. And so, when you really think about it, the concepts of reservations, the concepts of the inequalities you see on reservations are results of, colonialism. It's, the whole point of, westward expansion, the whole point of, at least in the Southwest here, we have the conquistadors. You see the rich history of the conquistadors coming through New Mexico, but you also understand that it was not a peaceful, quiet taking of land. Rather, it was often very violent. It was often very much brutal, and I think part of it is relearning that part of history. And although it's uncomfortable, and although you can say, but what does it have to do with me today? I don't have any, like, those are not my grandparents, or those are not my relatives who've done it. But it's like, but you have to think about it too. But where do you live? Whose land do you occupy? And how is it taken so that your family could occupy these lands? And so it's really taking that step forward and really, or step backwards, and really thinking about, okay, well, then how did land ownership come to be? Because that's definitely a very westernized concept, because at least in a lot of various indigenous communities, and I can only speak for the Navajo Nation itself, it's like is that we're caretakers of our land around us. We don't own it, because Mother Earth is her own entity. She's her own being. So we take care of her, and in return, she takes care of us. And so when you talk about deeds and land and ownership, that's not a very familiar concept to Indigenous people. So yes, you might say, what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with, with who I am, and why is it important to you today? And I would urge you to think about it a step further. So the Navajo Nation used to, we're still in our tribal government and leadership is in currently the transition of, figuring out what to do with coal power plants. So where I live on the Navajo Nation, we are right on like the Arizona, New Mexico border, but in northwestern New Mexico, I don't know, about 20 minutes east of Shiprock, New Mexico, there are two power plants, the San Juan Generating Station and the Four Corners Power Plant. On the western end of the Navajo Nation near Page, Arizona, you have one of the largest power plants in Western United States that brought power to a whole bunch of cities. And so I did not understand the impact of that until I went to school at Azusa. So, my first year I lived off campus. So of course, you have to do utilities and whatnot. I went down to the local utility company to pay my deposit for utilities. And this was the most mind-blowing moment ever. I went down and I was waiting in line, and I was looking at the walls of like, okay, cool pictures, and on it, they were saying, this is where we get our power, from the Four Corners Power Plant. And I was like, what? I had moved to Southern California, of where the city of Azusa gets power from the coal mine on my reservation, from the power plant on my reservation.
Wow.
And it's here in Los Angeles. And yet so many Navajo families on the reservation, even now, don't have access to electricity, to running water, to these amenities. And it just was this mind-blowing moment of like, I am, 10, 11, 12 hours away from home, but I'm still connected to home. Because the city of Azusa buys its electricity from the power plant at home, from the coal that is fueling the power plant so that everyone in Azusa could get electricity is Navajo coal. It's mined on Navajo land. It was mind-blowing to make that connection. Mind-blowing.
Wow. Nicole, wow, yeah, and it's mind-blowing to hear that. And you just said that, and which is very critical thinking, is you said there are people on the Navajo Nation that don't even have electricity and so on. So how would one even begin to even, I guess, not even reconcile is the right word, but how would someone even start to think about that? I mean, how is that even equity and justice for people? I mean, what are the discussions like that you might be a part of that even talk about that?
Well, I think part of it is, it really comes, and okay, so to kind of back up a little bit, last year, if you guys had paid close attention into communities and people that were affected heavily by COVID-19, the Navajo Nation was one of them. It spread rampantly throughout the Navajo Nation. Why? Because we didn't have the access to clean running water. And without clean running water, you can't wash your hands for 20 seconds to make sure your hands are clean. And that is one of the reasons why we really the COVID-19 spread crazy like wildfire through the Navajo Nation, but also we live in very much intergenerational. I mean, even now here, I'm home back on the Navajo Nation, and I have my 91-year-old grandma, in the next room. I have my mom here. I have myself here. There's 3 generations in this household, but that's not uncommon. We're very tight knit. We're very much wanting to be in community with each other, to help each other, because in Navajo culture, it's ethnicity as familialship and connection and clanship. That's so important to be part of. And so, again, going back to why COVID-19 spread like wildfire, is that because you have so many generations under one household. Someone catches it, you don't have access to running water to even wash your hands, to adequately sanitize things. So of course it's going to, continuously spread. And because of that, there's been a lot of funding through the ARPA funds, through the CARES Act funding, to get, proper infrastructure to tribal nations. And so part of the conversations today is like, okay, well, how do we bring, more infrastructure in terms of, and when you think of infrastructure, it's not just clean running water, it's not just electricity, it's also now broadband, it's now internet. How do we bring that so it's equitable to, Indigenous communities, and even accessible roads? Because I think it was like last year, what broke my heart, was to see, because kids could not go to school on the Navajo Nation, what broke my heart was knowing that seeing pictures of pop-up tents in like the middle of 80, 90 degree weather, and just folding tables and folding chairs. And you have like anywhere from kindergartners to like middle school age kids sitting underneath these hot tents because their homes don't have internet. But how are they supposed to go to school? But they're sitting under there because the school is trying to give them, a hot spot so that they can all join in. And so it's like, it's heartbreaking to see this, but it's also, that reminder of, this is the inequality that Indigenous people face, that this is the reality for so many Indigenous communities. And when you start talking about the conversation, how do you bring running water? How do you bring electricity? How do you bring, broadband and Wi-Fi and access to that? What do you think about? It comes down to land. Who has the right to say what happens to land? Oftentimes with tribal land, it's not an easy answer. We don't have things of like eminent domain that cities might have. You might have to run your lines through federal trust land, so you have to get the federal government involved. You might have to run it through state land, so you have to get the states involved, and then you finally run it through tribal land. Wow. So then it really comes back to the focus of land, and part of that movement of land acknowledgements, and with that is another step further of what we call land back. is giving us, quite frankly, our land back, because who are the best stewards of the land that you occupy? Indigenous people. There's, talk about how well Indigenous people know, and just in our existence of how we take care of the land too. How do we, nurture biodiversity in our areas that we know well? It's us. How do we know that? Because we've been here since time immemorial, and we've cared for these lands, and it's like, give us back our land, and we can take care of it, like, trust us on this sense. And that's might be a hard concept for people to understand, of land back, but also, but it comes down to, again, the acknowledgement of, land acknowledgements. It comes back down to who has the right to say what happens on certain lands. So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking not only about how do you make it so that people have running water, electricity, all these things, but also how do you get that there? It comes down to land. And again, that kind of goes into to that conversation of like, well, then give us our land back so that we can have access to these things.
Yeah. You mentioned recognized, like federally recognized tribes. And then I know we've talked before about there are also unrecognized tribes
Right.
as well, right? What are the differences? I mean, or how many, do you know how many there happen to be of unrecognized, or that could be a large number? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So we have what is like federally recognized tribes, and then you can have state recognized tribes. And really, what it really comes down to sometimes is that it comes down to is kind of like the treaties in place, because during the time, I think of like the early 1800s to 1830s was, which is really unfortunate to say, it's like the Department of Interior was also the Department of War at time. And who were they at war with? Not necessarily Canada, Mexico, or any of the European nations at the time. It was Indigenous people. They were at war with Native Americans. So it was a Department of War, because Andrew Jackson, ask any Native, about Andrew Jackson, and they'll give you a very varied response, because that was the time of Indian termination, of Indian removal. And I think there was the Indian Removal Act, of quite literally what those words are, because, in order to get rid of us, there would be access, to land. And so what it comes down to is, in that era of like the 1800s, 1830s, where a lot of treaties were being made with tribes. And treaties, at the time would essentially lay claim from a nation to nation relationship. And so, but after, I think like the 1860s, 1870s, the United States stopped making treaties, because they realized, like, okay, well, if we make treaties, we now acknowledge that these tribes have existed prior to the existence of the United States. So we have to treat them as, a sovereign nation. And so, kind of, with that context, it's interesting, but it's also not. But I like to have a lot of these conversations. You kind of have to understand where we got to and what it means to, understand how, US history played a part. So going back to like, what is state and federal? So at the time, you could have tribes that if your tribe did not have like a signed treaty with the federal government, you could, have treaties with state governments. So then you become state recognized. And then what we have was like the Indian Self-Determination Act, in the 1960s, 70s, I could be wrong, but in that time frame, you had the Indian Reorganization Act, of where like, if you were to reorganize yourselves to do XYZ, you could get federal recognition. Or, and sometimes some tribes who went through that got their federal status taken away. So then they became only state recognition. And so I believe there are, I think like 60 to 65 state recognized tribes. And I think those are more along the East Coast per se, and not so much on the West Coast. On the Western end, we have a lot of federally recognized tribes. That's kind of where a lot of us um, are on, at least on the Western front. And even that's interesting too, because like if you were to really look at, US history, you see that a lot of the state recognition and all of the relocation was a lot of like the East Coast, up north in the Dakotas. But when you get to kind of like the Southwest area where I'm from, and how the Southwest became acquired to join the United States, we were a part of Mexico, prior to Mexico was the Spanish conquistadors. So that's why if you were to come to New Mexico, we do have a lot of the Spanish conquistador influence in New Mexico as well. But you would also see too of how land ownership had worked with, the different Pueblo tribes in New Mexico, as opposed to the Navajo people, as opposed to the Jicarilla or the Mescalero Apache people as well. And I mean, if you were to look at every state, each state is home to, several tribes. In New Mexico, we are home to 24 tribes. We have the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico. Each of them speak a different dialect. They have, similarities, but they're also very, uniquely different too. You have 3 Apache nations. Sometimes people forget about the Fort Sill Apache because they're right in that little part of New Mexico that touches the panhandle of Oklahoma. So that's kind of the Fort Sill Apache. You have the Mescalero Apache, in central southern New Mexico, and then you have the Jicarilla Apache Nation up in central northern New Mexico near the Navajo Nation as well. And then of course you have us, the Navajo Nation as well in that area too. But so when you go back to state and federally recognized tribes, you kind of see that the state recognized tribes are on the eastern band because they had more interaction or earlier interaction with, the European powers at play, whereas in the Southwest and on the western front into California, we were more bothered by the Spanish conquistadors coming through our area.
Wow. Yeah. There's such diversity within the indigenous people. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the diversity of Native American and indigenous people, just even from the language to, I know matriarchal leadership falls through your line. Is that correct, of Navajo? Like, is that central to all? Is it different?
Yeah, so I think that's really important to know too, and it's important to bring to light now that it's like Indigenous people were not just this one people that wear feathered headdresses and live in teepees. I remember someone asking me like, "Oh, so you live in a teepee?" And I was like, "What? No. We have hogans. We have 8-sided hogans in our tribe, And so, and it brings to show you too that, if you want to really be an ally and you really want to understand Indigenous people, it's like you have to break down the notion that we're not all the same, that someone who is Hopi Pueblo is different from someone who's Santo Domingo Pueblo, Kiowa Pueblo, or Acoma Pueblo. They're different. They speak different languages, and myself as Navajo, yes, our language is similar to certain Apache, like to the Apache language, but it's not the same. That, Jicarilla Apache Nation, they speak a little bit different than Mescalero Apache speaks, then Mescalero speaks different than White Mountain Apache, than San Carlos Apache, than Chiricahua Apache, and those are Apache nations. You can call them all Apache, but they're all different, and I've had to learn that too. I mean, and even in the way of, knowing the different dresses, I think it was, and I could be wrong, but I think it's like San Carlos Apache or Chiricahua Apache, they're the ones that have the jingles on the front of their dress. The ones that don't have the jingles on their dress, that's not that Apache. They're, Mescalero or they're Jicarilla Apache, and so and even in that sense too, it's like there's so much diversity in who we are. And this is just, this is just my familiarity of the tribes in the Southwest as well. I mean, even in our neighboring state of Arizona, you have the To'ono O'odham, you have the Havasupai, you have the Wallapai, you have, the Colorado River Indian tribes, you have the Gila River tribe, there's like, I think like 22 or 23 tribes in Arizona as well. And it's like, we're all different. We are all so different. But what makes us just, that diversity in indigeneity is that, because we're so diverse, the way to really understand and to really, see us and to really acknowledge us is that we're just, we're not lumped up into this one people. Yes, we're all Indigenous, but we're not all the same. That, our lineages could be different. In Navajo, our lineages, we're a matrilineal, we're a matriarchy society. So our lineage carries on through the women of our tribe. That's why we have clans. And like my clans, like my first clan comes from my mom. And my mom gets it from her mom, which is my grandma, comes from her mom, and so like that's how we trace our lineage in our tribes, is through women. And that ultimately, women are the decision makers, women are held into, higher regards. It's, it's all of this. But as different tribes might have different protocol. They might be more on the patrilineal side. They might be, they might trace lineage through their fathers more. It just, every tribe is different in their practices. Every tribe is different in the way that they have organized themselves too. Because when you think about tribes, we weren't just these uncivilized people roaming around North America. We've had our own way of governing ourselves. We've had our own way of, conducting society. And because we have our own ways of conducting society, that's what I think is important to remember too, is that when you look at the ruins of, Chaco Canyon, of Mesa Verde, of just across the United States, when you look at these ruins and these structures, it highlights that Indigenous people, we are an organized, structured, society, and we existed prior to the United States of America. There's even claims and even acknowledgement that, the Declaration of Independence was taken from parts of the Iroquois Nation, the Iroquois Confederacy, and so it's like, even in that sense too, it's like, where is that acknowledgement? It's not always there. It's always forgotten. But we are here, and we are part of, US history, some of its darkest moments, but also some of, I think, its gleaming moments as well. And some of like the cool part about it is that, last week was, Veterans Day. Native Americans are some of the highest minority to enroll in the military. My father is a Marine Corps veteran. His father, my grandfather, was a Navajo code talker in World War II, which, they used the Navajo language, and it was the code that was never broken on the Western Front and in the Pacific as well. So of course, we do have, our moments of, really helping and really wanting to be and assisting the United States, but also we do that understanding, though, at the same time that, often it's almost conflicting, it's almost conflicting of how do you give so much help knowing that you're not often recognized on your own grounds? Because when my grandfather came back from World War II, guess what? He couldn't vote, but he could serve in war, and they could use our language. And so as all this, I think, constant rectifying and constant, understanding of how things have come to be. And part of that, is acknowledging our past and the past, federal Indian policies of how they've come to play into now, into the current, the current Indigenous people that you do encounter, and when you think about it too, part part of that history is, the boarding school system. My grandmother ran away from boarding schools, and because she had ran away from boarding school, she was able to retain, Navajo language, Navajo culture, and, who we are as, Navajo people. And, my mother attended a boarding school as well. But at that time she went to a boarding school for a few years, and then she went to like a day school, but it was formerly a boarding school. I myself and my two brothers, we graduated from former boarding schools in our local border town. That's what we call them, the towns that are located off the reservation near the border of the Navajo Nation. And so like I'm a graduate of high school from a formerly known boarding school. So, in every way you can think about it, every Indigenous person that you have encountered will have had their life impacted by federal Indian policy.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful. It's really powerful. I just now looking down at our clock, and we've just flown it by, and the conversation, this could be a whole week of a conversation. And but I wanted to ask maybe what do you feel most people, well, I think everyone on this call either is specifically connected to higher education, Christian higher education. What would you say is like the charge you would give us as a community going forward on about what you've just talked about? I mean, what can we continue to be doing? What do we need to learn? How do we see better and do better? I mean, is that a question? Is that a question? Like, what should we be doing?
I think first and foremost, understanding the land that you occupy, and maybe taking a step further of understanding how the land that you occupy became occupied. Was it through treaties? Was it through forced relocation? And I think that's the first step in understanding that, and even like the names in your communities and the names of where things come from, it's like that might have been, native influenced, like the state of Utah. That's that Utah, it comes from, a word from, I think it was like the Southern Ute tribe. And so it's like, you don't learn that until later on in life, until you have the curiosity to do so. So I think, first and foremost, the step is always, understanding how the land you occupied became occupied, and, really wanting to, I guess, also understand too of like the local tribes in your area, go visit their museum, go see what, they do in the community and learn. And really, I think, giving the space for Indigenous people to amplify their voices, to have them have a seat at the table, but knowing that when we have a seat at the table, we're going to be bringing people with us. Because at least a lot of like in Indigenous cultures, we are a collective. We don't just think about ourselves, but we think about our families. We think about our communities. We think about, who else should be at this table too. So, always, land is important. I think it's always good to know, whose land you're on, how it became occupied, but also be understanding, the tribes in your area. Do they have a cool history? Like, learn the history about it, be involved, with the tribal members there. I think a lot of Indigenous people, we are now, more open and finding more allyship, because it's no longer seen as being like leery of, outsiders or non-Indigenous people, but also I think it really comes down to the economic impact of, if you are to buy anything, don't buy native inspired, buy from inspired natives, buy, authentic work from, Indigenous tribes as well. I think that's like one of the most important facts, because like we have beautiful artwork, we have beautiful things, we have beautiful clothing, we have beautiful footwear, we have all these really awesome things, but we often see other businesses kind of taking, shots at patterns that, are not necessarily theirs, but it might belong to a different tribe. Some of them, like the Pendleton Blanket Company out of Pendleton, Oregon, wonderful woolen blankets, but they, but you can buy from, eighth generation. They're also a wool blanket company as well. Just finding ways to really buy, and advocate, I think, first and foremost, is, not buying inspired by cultures, but rather buying from them. There's definitely a whole list of, Indigenous designers, makeup brands, everything. One of my good friends, she owns a makeup brand that's been in Vogue, that's been in Cosmopolitan and everything. And, she's a native owned makeup brand operating here on the Navajo Nation as well. So, there are avenues to, really, I think, amplify our voices, and we're really making a strong sense towards that. So I think, just taking some extra time to learn and taking a step further of understanding like who is in your area, how can you support them, whether it's, buying their art or learning their history, or, volunteering some time there, seeing like what you might be able to do too. So I think those are just some small ways of, how you can build a better rapport or, allyship with Indigenous people.
No, that's good. You brought up something that is probably a longer answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyways, is I think a number of people kind of vacillate between appropriation and appreciation. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like appreciation for, because what you said about inspired by and inspired, I think that's a powerful statement. So I wonder if that kind of goes together too.
Yeah, it kind of does go together of appropriation versus appreciation. If you, one thing is always to credit, where credit is due. All of y'all are in college, so citations. I feel like that should carry on no matter what you do, is always, citing where, where this comes from, and asking if you have someone who's native and like, hey, like, I really like, this design I saw on something, and I know you're from that tribe. How would you feel if I were to use it in XYZ? And they might say, yeah, go ahead. But credit the inspiration, this is originally where this had come from. If it's anything in terms of like your own interpretation of art or of music, I think that's always important, to ask permission from, either like someone of that tribe, because they have more closer ties to, whatever it is. They might tell you, no, you can't do that because that's not meant for you. And that's something too that as a non-Indigenous person, you might have to feel comfortable with, is being told no, because in our cultures, there are certain things that are just meant for us. And there are some things that we can share with you. And so always asking for permission. I think we live in the, in this consent movement era. So, consent is always is there in this sense too, asking, is it okay? Is it okay if I use this symbolism? Is this color scheme like okay? Like for myself, I didn't understand that, like orange pumpkin colors meant something in Pueblo culture. I didn't see it as that, but my friend brought it out as it. And so she was saying like, we shouldn't do XYZ and like orange colors because, someone from, one of the 8 northern Pueblos could be upset by it. And I was like, oh, okay. And of course it's like wanting to constantly learn and constantly challenge yourself. So, consent, cite, give credit of where credit's due. But if it's also buying something of art, definitely, support Native artists, of footwear, of clothing. Bethany Yellowtail is great. She does awesome work as well. There's a whole slew of us who do a whole bunch of art. I think it's just a matter of, just setting some extra time aside to just do a little bit of research will help.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you for that. And then one other thing, culturally, currently right now, you had mentioned, because you spoke to my Intro to Ethnic Studies class back in October, you talked about a current series that's out called Reservoir. Is it Res Dogs? Is that what it is? Is that
Yeah, it's Reservation Dogs. It's
Reservation
produced by
Dogs?
Taika Waititi and put together by Sterling Harjo of the Muskogee Cree Nation. It's on Hulu. Highly recommend. I mean, I think it's just one of when I had seen the first episode of Reservation Dogs, I think I almost cried because it was awesome to see this current representation of Indigenous people um, on the screen where we're not stereotyped, that we're not just like cowboys and Indians type of concept. We're not just this, historical two-dimensional type of person that we are people and this is who we are and we have our own sense of humor. And I think Reservation Dogs does a really good job of bringing you along like with the humor as well. I'm really excited to hear that they are having a second season. So I mean, if you have time this week or anytime at all, I would highly recommend Reservation Dogs. It's awesome. I think it does a really great job of representing current Indigenous people, and you will see the diversity of the cast. They're all Indigenous, but they don't all look the same. We don't all have the same features, but it's awesome because you can see that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I remember you saying that. I thought, yeah, what a way for people to engage as well, especially in the culture along that. So, well, this brings us to the end of our conversation, but for today, it'll definitely, you've been an amazing voice to not only to my class that I've taught for the last few years, but also to our Mel scholars, because you've been back as a speaker for our multi-ethnic leaders scholars, and now the opportunity to speak to faculty and staff as an alum. And so we look forward to the continued journey with you as well, that you are bringing us along in this conversation as well, for us to know more and to do better as people. So I thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you for your conversation today. And I believe this ends our time. It's actually 11:21 right now, but I believe this is the end of the webinar today. But look for more from the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office as we continue to celebrate our Indigenous people and Native American people. So thank you so much.
Oh, we'll see ya.
Thank you, Nicole.